During most of the prehistoric period, people lived in small groups and moved from place to place in search of food. They hunted, fished, as well as gathered wild plants. Around 9000 BC, the development of agriculture began with the growing of crops and the domestication of animals in the Middle East. As prehistoric people became better farmers, they began to produce enough food to support larger villages. In due course of time, some farming villages developed into the first cities. Food was aplenty and more people began to take up other occupations. They began to develop the arts, crafts, trades and other activities of civilized life. Agriculture also led to social and technological changes. Farmers invented the hoe, the sickle and other farming implements to make their work easier. The invention of farming paved way for the development of civilization. The word civilization comes from the Latin civis, which means citizen of a city. A civilization consists of the art, customs, technology, form of government, and everything else that makes up the way of life in society. Ancient civilization refers to the way of life that existed around the Mediterranean Sea, beginning before 3000 BC and ending with the fall of Rome in 476 AD. Early civilizations arose and flourished in the river valleys for various reasons. One of the reasons being that the soil of the river valley is very fertile. Hence, agriculture was easier here than elsewhere. The inhabitants of this place could get water for themselves, cattle and their fields. It was very easy to sink wells or dig canals in the soft soil of these rivers. They could get food by fishing, grow crops and could get soft clay for building their houses. The inhabitants of this place could use the rivers to go from place to place in their crude boats. Transportation and communication was easy. The earliest civilizations arose in the four river valleys of Asia and Africa between 3500 BC and the 1700s BC. The earliest of them all is the civilization that was born in the valley of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Sumerian civilization. By the 5000s BC, villages and settlements had started developing in the fertile plains lying between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in southern Mesopotamia. This area came to be known as Sumer. By 3500 BC, the Sumerians, a highly energetic and inventive group of people, gave rise to the world's first civilization. It flourished until about 2000 BC and was later absorbed by the great empires of Babylonia and Assyria. The Sumerians boast of a long list of achievements. Firstly, the Sumerian culture was highly developed. They were well versed in legal, economic, literary and religious matters. They also studied mathematics, astronomy and medicine. Their system of counting in units of 60 is the basis of the 360-degree circle and the 60-minute hour. The Sumerians invented the first form of writing, which consisted of picture-like symbols scratched on clay. The symbols were later simplified to produce cuneiform, a system of writing that uses wedge-shaped characters. The Sumerians invented the art of metallurgy and discovered copper. By adding tin to copper, they made bronze and ushered in the Bronze Age. Sumerian society was divided into three classes. The first was the upper class that was made up of members of the royal family, priests and high officials. The farmers, artisans and traders belonged to the middle class, whereas the lower class consisted of slaves who tilled the land. Slaves were treated well in the Sumerian society though. The women in Sumer enjoyed a respectable position. The main occupation of the Sumerians was agriculture.
Harappan culture. In 1922 AD, archaeology revealed the existence of vast civilization in the region of Indus Valley, with its two centers at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro that belonged to 3000 BC. The buildings were built on high ground, and the houses were made of burnt bricks. Streets of Mohenjo-daro were straight and 3 to 10 meters wide. Every house had its own well. And there was a good drainage system. Houses of rich people in Harappa consisted of 5 or 6 wide rooms, whereas those of the common people consisted of about 1 or 2 rooms. The people of Indus Valley civilization were experts in town planning. The greatest example of this is the remarkable structure in Mohenjo-daro called the Great Bath or the swimming pool, which is built of bricks. It had steps on its north and south sides, and a well was used to send water into the pool. There was also an alternate arrangement to send hot water into the pool. Harappa also consisted of houses for laborers. Commonly, each city was divided into 2 basic parts, one which consisted of government buildings which were built on the high ground, and the second one consisted of the public buildings which were built in the low land towards the east. The hill forts were constructed on the high land of the west region. Bricks were used to construct drain pipers in every street, and the drains of houses were linked with the street drains which carry the water out. This kind of good drainage system was found nowhere else. The drainage system of the Harappan culture is still unparalleled for that time.
Introduction to Egyptian civilization. There are very few places on the face of this planet which fascinate us because of their sheer presence or existence. One such incredible enigma seen on the world map is the country of Egypt, and even more incredible is the history of its civilization. The deserts provided natural protection against foreign invaders, and the early Egyptian settlers enjoyed many years of freedom from attack, during which they could build a society of their own. The river Nile was the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. Every year, the river with unfailing predictability overflowed and deposited rich black soil along each bank. This enabled farmers to raise 2 to 3 harvests each year. The Nile also provided water for irrigation and served as ancient Egypt's main transportation route. Historians usually divide the history of ancient Egypt into 3 categories. The Old Kingdom, 2686 to 2200 BC. The Middle Kingdom, 2200 to 1800 BC. And the New Kingdom, 1600 to 1100 BC. However, the earliest known settlers in ancient Egypt were in villages established over 5,000 years ago. During the rule of Dynasty I and Dynasty II, the first national government was established, the ox-driven plough was invented, and a system of writing called hieroglyphic, different from the Sumerian cuneiform, developed. The Babylonian civilization. Babylon, which means the gate of the god, known to be the most splendid city of the ancient world, was the capital of the kingdom of Babylonia. It stood on the banks of the river Euphrates in what is now southeastern Iraq. Around 2200 BC, a dynasty, or rule by one family, was founded in Babylon. The best-known king of that dynasty was Hammurabi, who ruled for 42 years from 1792 BC to 1750 BC. Hammurabi set up limits for maximum prices and minimum wages and gave his kingdom a fair system of taxation. He introduced language reforms. He gave rights to slaves, with the help of which they could own property, conduct business, borrow money, and even buy their freedom. Many beautiful temples and palaces were built during his reign. The Babylonians used glazed tiles to cover mud brick walls. The city of Babylon was protected by thick, high walls decorated with motifs of glazed tiles. A wide moat surrounded the inner walls. People entered and left the city through 8 bronze gates. The Greeks referred to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Traces of these gardens have been found in the form of a huge arch with thick layers of earth on the roof. In chambers beneath the structure were 3 shafts, which probably had pumps for raising the water to the gardens above. The Babylonians were a Semitic race who absorbed the culture of the original Sumerian inhabitants. They were also agriculturists and greatly improved upon the farming methods pioneered by the Sumerians. Temples were used as schools. Boys were taught reading, writing and arithmetic, while the girls were trained in dance and music. Lack of timber, stone and metal made trade necessary. Trade and commerce flourished. Trade was mostly through barter system or exchange of goods. Silver coins were also used as a medium of exchange. Skilled artisans like carpenters, blacksmiths, goldsmiths, weavers, potters and metal workers were encouraged, and they made good progress in their respective professions.
In the 4th century BC, the manufacture and trade of iron led to the rise of another empire, Kush, which became a powerful trading center located near the modern-day border of Egypt and Sudan in northeast Africa. Much of Kush bordered the Sahara, but the city of Meroe, in the southern part of the country, was dotted with trees. The people of Kush used this timber to fire the furnaces they used to produce iron. In addition, Meroe had a rich supply of iron ore, the mineral from which iron is made. Meroe was also located not far from the Red Sea, which gave Kush good access to the major trading centers further south. In addition to iron, the people of Kush traded gold, jewelry, pottery, and ivory. Meroe thrived for nearly 1,000 years. During that time, the Kushites developed an advanced society, adopted some Roman-style architecture, and developed their own written language. The Kush Empire also gave women more political power than did most other ancient empires. In fact, several Kush monarchs were women. But just as iron had an impact on the rise of Kush, it also had an effect on its fall. Meroe's economy began to suffer during the 4th century AD. One reason for the decline may have been the loss of forests in Nubia, where trees were harvested to fuel the iron industry. In about AD 350, the neighboring kingdom of Aksum invaded Kush, and the Kush Empire fell.
The Golden Age of Ancient Greece. The years following the defeat of Persia between 480 BC and 430 BC are regarded by historians as the Golden Age, since the most glorious achievements of Greece in the field of art, literature, theatre, government, philosophy, mathematics, and sports occurred during this period. Athens reached its height of power and glory under the able leadership of the Athenian statesman Pericles, whose career spanned most of the Golden Age. Pericles was one of the most prominent and influential statesmen around, a great orator, and lastly, the general of Athens. Another unique feature of the Golden Age in Greece was its democratic government. The word democracy is a Greek word meaning the government of the people, and this democratic form of government was established in Athens and headed by Pericles. All the citizens of Athens except women and slaves were members of the General Assembly, and it was known as ecclesia. The general business of the government was carried out by a council of 500 members, which was called the Senate. Military and foreign affairs of the state were controlled by a powerful board of 10 generals, called the Strategii. Athens had a citizens' court of justice, which protected the rights of the Athenians. There were no magistrates, and hence only juries decided the cases. Under the Athenian democracy, citizens were known to be extremely devoted and patriotic. Athens produced a few of the most revered philosophers of all times. For instance, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were considered the most important Greek philosophers. The theatres in Greece were not like most of those we have now. They were always outdoor theatres. usually on the side of the hill, where a grandstand could be built facing the stage. The Greek theatre at Epidaurus in the Peloponnese boasted of 55 tiers of stone seats, accommodating 14,000 spectators, fanned steeply like the sides of a bowl around the circular orchestra where the chorus performed.
When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming.
Slaves' resistance to their dehumanization took many forms, but the primary way was by forming families. Family was a refuge for slaves and a source of dignity that masters recognized and sought to stifle. A paternalistic slave owner named Bennett H. Barrow wrote in his Rules for the Highland Plantation, "No rule that I have stated is of more importance than that relating to Negroes marrying outside of the plantation. It creates a feeling of independence." Most slaves did marry, usually for life, and when possible, slaves grew up in two-parent households. Single-parent households were common, though, as a result of one parent being sold. In the Upper South, where the economy was shifting from tobacco to different, less labor-intensive cash crops, the sale of slaves was common. Perhaps 1/3 of slave marriages in states like Virginia were broken up by sale. Religion was also an important part of life in slavery. While masters wanted their slaves to learn the parts of the Bible that talked about being happy in bondage, slave worship tended to focus on the stories of Exodus, where Moses brought the slaves out of bondage, or biblical heroes who overcame great odds like Daniel and David. And although most slaves were forbidden to learn to read and write, many did anyway, and some became preachers. Slave preachers were often very charismatic leaders, and they roused the suspicion of slave owners, and not without reason. Two of the most important slave uprisings in the South were led by preachers. Medieval Europe had less trade, fewer cities, and less cultural output than the original Roman Empire. London and Paris were fetid fire traps with none of the planning or sewage management of places 5,000 years older like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley civilization, let alone Rome. But with fewer powerful governments, wars were at least smaller, which is one reason why Europeans living in medieval times... Oh, thought bubble, I knew you were gonna do that! Anyway, people in medieval times lived slightly longer. Life expectancy was 30 than Europeans during the Roman Empire, when life expectancy was 28. Instead of centralized governments, Europe in the Middle Ages had feudalism, a political system based on reciprocal relationships between lords, who owned lots of land, and vassals, who protected the land and got to dress up as knights in exchange for pledging loyalty to the lords. The lords were also vassals to more important lords, with the most important of all being the king. Below the knights were peasants, who did the actual work on the land in exchange for protection from bandits and other threats. Feudalism was also an economic system, with the peasants working the land and keeping some of their production to feed themselves while giving the rest to the landowner whose land they worked. The small-scale local nature of the feudal system was perfect for a time and place where the threats to people's safety were also small-scale and local. But of course, this system reinforces the status quo. There's little freedom and absolutely no social mobility. Peasants could never work their way up to lords, and they almost never left their villages. The Industrial Revolution was an increase in production brought about by the use of machines and characterized by the use of new energy sources.
In the late 1700s, most people worked in the fields, on land they did not own. Those who owned the land, called aristocrats, lived refined lives in elegant manor houses. Servants raised their children and did their housework. The landowners and the people who worked for them depended upon each other. It was a system that had existed for centuries. In towns across England and the United States, a series of extraordinary innovations would alter the way people lived and worked for the next 150 years. Inventors had found new ways to harness nature's energy. They built new kinds of machines, powered by water, steam, and coal. The new machines replaced hand-powered tools. They did the same work, only cheaper and faster. Much of the work was done outside the home, in specially designed buildings, the first factories. Mechanization began in the textile mills of England, where one machine attached to a spinning wheel could do the work of 50 people. Fuel, clothing, and food all became more affordable. With the development of locomotives and steamboats, manufactured goods could now be sold halfway around the world. Families moved from the villages of their ancestors to new industrial towns. And a new class of people emerged, workers who produced goods. Industrialists, the people who owned the factories, employed hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. And they made enormous profits in their industrial centers. But while the Industrial Revolution brought wealth to some and jobs for others, it came with a price tag. Pollution from coal-powered factories turned the cities black. Lack of housing created the first urban slums. And the demand for more and more goods and higher profits brought the exploitation of workers, including children.
The innovations of the Industrial Revolution were intimately interconnected. Like, look for instance at the British textile industry. The invention of the flying shuttle by John Kay in 1733 dramatically increased the speed of weaving, which in turn created demand for yarn, which led to inventions like the spinning jenny and the water frame. Soon these processes were mechanized using water power until the steam engine came along to make flying shuttles really fly in these huge cotton mills. The most successful steam engine was built by Thomas, they didn't name anything after me, Newcomen, to clear water out of mines, and because water was cleared out of those mines, there was more coal to power more steam engines, which eventually led to the fancying up of the Newcomen steam engine by James I got a unit of power and a university named after me Watt, whose engine made possible not only railroads and steamboats, but also ever more efficient cotton mills. And for the first time, chemicals other than stale urine, I wish I was kidding, were being used to bleach the cloth that people wore. The first of which was sulfuric acid, which was created in large quantities only thanks to lead-lined chambers, which would have been impossible without lead production rising dramatically right around 1750 in Britain, thanks to lead foundries powered by coal. And all these factors came together to make more yarn that could be spun and bleached faster and cheaper than ever before, a process that would eventually culminate in $18 CrashCourse Mongol shirts, available now at dftba.com. So let's say it's 1200 CE and you're a rug merchant. Just like merchants today, you sometimes need to borrow money in order to buy the rugs you want to resell at a profit, and then you pay that money back, often with interest, once you've resold the rugs. This is called mercantile capitalism, and it was a global phenomenon, from the Chinese to the Indian Ocean Trade Network to Muslim merchants who would sponsor trade caravans across the Sahara. But by the 17th century, merchants in the Netherlands and in Britain had expanded upon this idea to create joint stock companies. Those companies could finance bigger trade missions and also spread the risk of international trade. But the thing about international trade is sometimes boats sink or they get taken by pirates, and while that's bad if you're a sailor because, you know, you lose your life, it's really bad if you're a mercantile capitalist because you lost all your money. But if you own 1/10 of 10 boats, your risk is much better managed. That kind of investment definitely increased wealth, but it only affected a sliver of the population, and it didn't create a culture of capitalism. Industrial capitalism was something altogether different, both in scale and in practice. Let's use Joyce Appleby's definition of industrial capitalism: an economic system that relies on investment of capital in machines and technology that are used to increase production of marketable goods. Industrial capitalism developed first in Britain in the 19th century. Britain had a bunch of advantages. It was the dominant power on the seas, and it was making good money off of trade with its colonies, including the slave trade. Also, the growth of capitalism was helped by the half-century of civil unrest that resulted from the 17th century English Civil War. Now, I'm not advocating for civil wars or anything, but in this particular case, it was useful because before the war, the British Crown had put a lot of regulations on the economy, complicated licenses, royal monopolies, etc. But during the turmoil, it couldn't enforce them, which made for freer markets. Another factor was a remarkable increase in agricultural productivity in the 16th century. As food prices started to rise, it became profitable for farmers, both large and small, to invest in agricultural technologies that would improve crop yields. Those higher prices for grain probably resulted from population growth, which in turn was encouraged by increased production of food crops. A number of these agricultural improvements came from the Dutch, who had chronic problems feeding themselves and discovered that planting different kinds of crops, like clover that added nitrogen to the soil and could be used to feed livestock at the same time, meant that more fields could be used at once. This increased productivity eventually brought down prices, and this encouraged further innovation in order to increase yield to make up for the drop in prices. Lower food prices had an added benefit. Since food cost less and wages in England remained high, workers would have more disposable income, which meant that if there were consumer goods available, they would be consumed, which incentivized people to make consumer goods more efficiently and therefore more cheaply. You can see how this positive feedback loop leads to more food and more stuff, culminating in a world where people have so much stuff that we must rent space to store it, and so much food that obesity has become a bigger killer than starvation. In most cases, Europeans ruled their colonies with the help of, and sometimes completely through, intermediaries and collaborators. For example, in the 1890s in India, there were fewer than 1,000 British administrators supposedly ruling over 300 million Indians. The vast majority of British troops at any given time in India, more than 2/3, were in fact Indians under the command of British officers. Because of their small numbers relative to local populations, most European colonizers resorted to indirect rule, relying on the governments that were already there but exerting control over their leaders. Frederick Lugard, who was Britain's head honcho in Nigeria for a time, called this rule through and by the natives. This worked particularly well with British administrators, who were primarily middle-class men but had aristocratic pretensions and were often pleased to associate with the highest echelons of Indian or African society. Now, this isn't to say that indigenous rulers were simply puppets. Often they retained real power. This was certainly true in India, where more than a third of the territory was ruled by Indian princes. The French protectorates of Morocco and Tunisia were ruled by Arab monarchs, and the French also ruled through native kings in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. For the most part, Europeans could almost always rely on their superior military technology to coerce local rulers into doing what the Europeans wanted, and they could replace native officials with Europeans if they had to, but in general, they preferred to rule indirectly. It was easier and cheaper, also less money.
500 years ago, transoceanic travel became a reality. Since the end of the last ice age, farming societies had been absorbing their neighbors, making populations more similar within continents. But when people began to cross oceans in large numbers, the genetic and cultural differences between people from different continents also began to fade, though not disappear. Many families relocated, willingly or unwillingly, to very distant lands. Sometimes they found unoccupied lands, and sometimes they found lands occupied and wished they weren't. And sometimes they found land and labor and devised ways of exploiting both. All over the world, people separated by thousands of kilometers for thousands of years began meeting once again and producing children. Today, whole regions, like the Americas, are populated by people who can trace their ancestry back to multiple continents. But some small groups are more geographically or culturally isolated and remain genetically distinguishable. As long-distance transportation gets easier and easier and individual societies become more diverse, languages are being lost and genetic distinctions across the globe are fading. But these genetic distinctions are a relatively recent phenomenon in our history. We haven't been separated for very long.
Right hand, all right? And the distance from your middle to the tip of your finger represents all the time since life began. That's 4,000 million years. Can anybody guess roughly where, say, the dinosaurs were on this scale? Yes.
On the wrist?
Yeah, that's not bad. It's surprisingly recent. And all of historical time, that's Jesus and King David and the pyramids and ancient Babylon, the ancient Egyptians, all that time, everything you've ever learned about in history, where do you think that would come?
Is this far away from your tip of your finger or something like that?
It's much, no, it's much further than that. Why do you think I handed out those nail files? If you get your nail file and get your middle finger and just do one stroke of the nail file and look at the dust that falls from your nail, and you might see a few grains of dust that fall from the tip of your nail. And the whole of human history has fallen in the dust from one stroke of the nail file. Has fallen in the dust from one stroke of the nail file.
This is a present human being. These are us, people, complex beings. To remember two simple facts about us. In order to survive, we need food. Food is any substance or materials eaten or drunk to provide nutritional support for the body or for pleasure. It usually consists of plant or animal origin that contains essential nutrients, such as carbohydrates, fats, proteins, vitamins, or minerals, and is ingested and assimilated by an organism to produce energy, stimulate growth, and maintain life. This, and oxygen. The rest is depending on the environment. Comfort, education, evolution. So, keep in mind this, we need food and oxygen in order to survive. Remember who we are.